Nature has this innate wisdom with food. A lot of nutrients work in tandem or in synergy with other nutrients, and we're just barely starting to pull apart or maybe put back together those pieces to unravel how it all works together. We just know it does work together, and we have more and more examples of how that actually comes into play in real life via some of these new studies.
Welcome to the Journey to Birth podcast. I have another very special guest today who is going to get real with us about real food for pregnancy. And if you already know who I'm talking about, that probably gave it away if you've ever read her book, Real Food for Pregnancy. But if you're not familiar with her, today's guest is Lily Nichols, author of Real Food for Pregnancy and Real Food for Gestational Diabetes, and a registered dietitian nutritionist. I wanted to bring Lily on to share her well-rounded perspective on nutrition for pregnancy because she's a conventionally trained dietitian who has stepped outside of the conventional boundaries of medical dietetics to study beyond the USDA pyramid and seek a deeper truth about how we should be approaching our nutrition. Really all of the time, but especially as it pertains to prenatal health and feeding your growing baby. Now, Lily has been on countless other podcasts sharing information about the research and what studies are saying about nutrition, and I will link to some of those in the show notes if you'd like to hear more about that specifically. But while I had her here, I wanted to explore a little bit more about her insights into some less well-researched areas, and I wanted to find out what drives her to keep doing this work that is benefiting so many of us and so many families in so many ways. Lily is truly an inspiring advocate for real food and for families everywhere. So I hope you enjoy sitting in with us on this conversation. Oh, and stay tuned until the very end if you want to hear what that strange noise is that you might hear in the background. This is real food and real life in the times of COVID. And now onto my conversation with Lily Nichols on the Journey to Birth. Welcome to the Journey to Birth podcast. Today, I am super excited to bring Lily Nichols on. Lily is a real food registered dietitian, and I will let her explain what that means to her. She's also the author of Real Food for Gestational Diabetes and Real Food for Pregnancy, both books that I recommend to a lot of people that I work with. If you haven't picked those up yet, I highly suggest them. But thank you so much for coming on today, Lily.
I appreciate the invite. Thank you.
So why don't you just start off with a quick introduction about what you do, what a real food registered dietitian is?
Sure. So first off, real food registered dietitian is not like an official term, right? So registered dietitian or registered dietitian nutritionist is, and that is my background, but myself and many of my colleagues put real food in front of it to sort of make a statement that we're not the stodgy food pyramid, eat your 11 servings of grains and have margarine on your bread kind of dietitians. So although my training is, conventional, I definitely embrace the real food side of things. And certainly as we were chatting beforehand, we both have a sort of Weston A. Price lens through which we view nutrition information. I'm also a certified diabetes educator, and both of my certifications, if you want to call them that, I've used primarily in the field of prenatal nutrition. So I've worked clinically at the public policy level with the state of California's diabetes and pregnancy program, on research studies, a fair amount of consulting and speaking, and now, of course, writing as well. And being able to see prenatal nutrition through all of those different lenses has certainly influenced the way I approach it, which I think is a lot different than many other people in the field who might only see it from a one-on-one clientele standpoint, or only from I'm sitting behind a computer screen, or only from I'm working on a research project. But when you see like all of it in totality, you see it differently. And ultimately that has really made me come to the realization and informed my work to the point that I think there's a large gap in where our current guidelines are on prenatal nutrition. And I think there's a lot of work to be done to improve upon them. And having seen the public policy side of things, even from, a very small angle from the organization I was involved in, also made me realize how it's so difficult with all the bureaucracy to get changes made on guidelines to actually reflect the current research. And so my work really has been focused on going direct to women themselves and clinicians who care for pregnant clients and giving them the information. And, it's up to you if you want to take it or leave it, but here's the information, here's the research to back it up. Up to you if you want to continue following the guidelines or you want to make some adjustments to the way that you approach prenatal nutrition, whether it's, the foods you're recommending to pregnant women or how you're approaching gestational diabetes or, you name it. I just really want to get it out on a grassroots level. So my work is, most people know me for my books, so Real Food for Gestational Diabetes and also Real Food for Pregnancy. And, I'm humbled that they've become quite popular and used in a lot of even courses, midwifery courses and undergraduate nutrition courses. And I'm hopeful that someday we'll see some changes in guidelines here in the US. I know my work influenced the change in guidelines in the Czech Republic, and I hope that other countries will follow suit.
That is wonderful to hear that things are starting to change. I know we were talking a bit before we started recording that I've been in the prenatal space for a little over a decade, and we never had any good books or reference material to give prenatal women about nutrition. So it would be like frantically writing up sheet after sheet of what they should be doing until 2015 is when the gestational diabetes book was published. Yeah, that one came out. And then 17 or 18 for Real Food for Pregnancy?
18.
Yeah, when those books came out, we finally had something to put into the hands of women that had all of this really rich and researched information, but also combined with that traditional food background that you were able to step back and get that bigger picture of, and that those books are just so enriching for women on their prenatal journey. So thanks for putting all of that work out.
Oh, thank you. I love hearing it's helpful.
Yeah, and doing what the second one you did while you had one kid.
Yeah, I had one kid at the time. I started writing Real Food for Pregnancy when I was about 10 months postpartum.
Okay. Yeah, that's a lot of work.
Yeah. I thought it would be a really easy project. I was like, well, I've done a book before. It's okay. There'll be a lot of overlap. And then I end up writing something that's like twice as long with, over 900 references. It just turned into this huge behemoth of a project.
Well, thank you for finishing it.
Yes. I had to get it out.
So since you have that kind of bigger picture perspective and the more focused perspective of having become a dietitian and gone through that process and then worked in public health, I would be really curious about your perspective about why we even have to eat. What is the purpose of us taking food into the body?
That's an interesting question that I'm not sure I've ever been asked. So just on a big scale, like zooming out about nutrition, our bodies require energy, and they also require specific nutrients in order to utilize that energy and run all of our cellular processes and all of our organs and our brain and everything. So you're looking from the big scale of just energy, your macronutrients, your fat, protein, and carbohydrates, and then your micronutrients, all your vitamins and minerals that help you make use of those macros. You need it for life. I mean, our body is made of elements, carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen mostly, that are found in those macronutrients. And that's how you run an animal. That's how a plant grows. It's through nutrients, through energy.
Yeah, I think life is exactly the big answer there. And when we're creating another life, it becomes even more important to be thinking about kind of these bigger concept of what does food really mean, that it has all of the macronutrients and the micronutrients, but the purpose of those is something even bigger than that. And when we're maybe not connecting with real food, we're taking food that's been demolished and then refortified, we're not getting that same life out of it.
Oh, taking it all the way down to like an energetic standpoint too. I mean,
Yeah.
certainly,
Yeah.
So the perspective I describe is what quote science has decided it means to get energy out of food. But there's undoubtedly, food that actually has like life force, things that have been grown in well-nourished soils. Or you think about, the difference in human health. You can have two human beings that are living and one person is struggling with chronic health conditions and the other person has lots of energy and feels really good and has a strong immune system. I mean, that's like the difference between, nutritionally devoid food versus vital food that's grown in healthy soil. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
you can
Perfect.
take it all the way to the energetic, perspective as well. Even though we have, less hardcore science maybe to back that up, you certainly notice, if you pay attention to the quality of food that you consume, how your body will physically feel different consuming things of differing qualities, right? Like, all-purpose, non-organic, fortified flour doesn't make my body feel good. And maybe I could be like, oh, that's a gluten issue. But I can take organically grown kamut or einkorn or some, ancient variety of wheat that has not been hybridized or has been less hybridized, that's grown in healthy soil, that isn't sprayed with a bunch of pesticides, it hasn't been sitting on a shelf for 2 years, and you ferment it, via natural sourdough fermentation. And then lo and behold, my body is totally fine tolerating that quote gluten, right? So there's always going to be like different degrees of which food has a certain quality or energy, and also, how our body processes it and metabolizes it and breaks it down and gets energy out of it as well.
Yeah. Yeah. That's exactly what I was looking for. So I'd also like to take a big step back, and you addressed this a little bit in the beginning, but the big picture of what you think we are doing wrong in our approach to prenatal nutrition, what ways that you're seeing that we're not really guiding women toward the right steps that are going to optimize their prenatal health.
So there are a number of ways that I think our guidelines fall short or just straight up backwards. So we have to remember that the guidelines for prenatal nutrition are drawn from the guidelines on adults, just adult Americans as a whole, the national guidelines. And so they're really not that much different. And they're not necessarily always based on very strong evidence just as a whole, but particularly when it comes to pregnancy, because a lot of times they don't even have studies on pregnant women specifically for a lot of nutrients, which surprises a lot of people. But when you actually go back, and I think this is so important for all clinicians to actually go back and look at how the guidelines were set, there's a lot of guesstimates, so many leaps to, well, absence of data, we'll just assume XYZ. So currently the guidelines are such that it's suggested you get 45 to 65% of your calories from carbohydrates, that you limit your intake of fat, especially saturated fat, that you limit your intake of cholesterol, that you limit your intake of salt, that you consume more of the small amount of fat you're supposed to eat. It should be mostly unsaturated. The protein requirements are kind of wishy-washy. They give a broad range in terms of like percent of calories from protein, but when you actually go to when they define a gram amount, that has been found to be woefully inadequate. I mean, the first ever study we have that directly estimated protein requirements in pregnant women was done in 2015, and they found that in late pregnancy, the estimated average requirement that's currently in place is 73% lower than it should be. So there's, just from the macronutrient standpoint, there's a whole bunch of problems. I mean, they pretty much need to be flipped in their head, reverse the amount of the fat to carbohydrate ratio the other way around so that people get more fat, not as many carbohydrates, better quality carbohydrates. We should not be limiting saturated fat. We should not be encouraging a lot of omega-6 fats from vegetable oils. I can go into all the reasons for it, but just from like a broad perspective, like the macronutrients are off. They're just backwards. Personally, when I look at prenatal nutrition and I'm like, okay, how can we do better? What do we know? What do we don't know? What we know better than like this top down, here's the macronutrient ratios you should have, and thus you should eat these foods. I look at it from the opposite perspective, and I reverse engineer from what we know about the micronutrient requirements and then go back up. So here we need this amount of vitamin B12, we need more iron, we need more vitamin A. We know a lot of these nutrient deficiencies are quite common. Okay, where do we find these nutrients in food? All right, let's come up with a realistic meal plan based upon food, having more of those foods incorporated. Then let's run a nutrition analysis. Let's see if we hit the micronutrients, and then let's see where the macronutrients show up. And that's where you get to my conclusion I just talked about a minute ago, where I think the macronutrient recommendations are backwards, because the vitamins and minerals that you need more of in pregnancy, more of for your own body, and more of to grow a healthy baby with a well-functioning brain, if you want to put it that way. If you look at the foods that you need to supply those, they are often foods with high amounts of protein and fat, and often foods of animal origin. It's not to mean that plants don't have their place, but we certainly shouldn't be getting 45 to 65% of our calories from high carbohydrate plants, which are devoid of vitamin B12, which have very low amounts and poorly absorbed iron and zinc, which really don't have iodine almost at all, which, so it's a complicated way of saying they need some work. It's a lot of work.
Yeah, they definitely do. No, you will not hear an argument from me about that. When you look back at what traditional cultures ate as well, just to get another perspective on how we should be eating and how the things that were important in those cultures for women to be eating when they were pregnant, because they were very invested in continuing their generations. One of the things they prioritized was diet. And there was definitely, in many cultures anyway, that I've studied, a lot of animal products, a lot of organ meat products were part of a normal prenatal diet. And it's interesting to see in traditional Chinese medicine, which is part of my background, if you go way back to the ancient recommendations, to see the different foods they recommended at each month of gestation and how they really correlate to the micronutrients that a woman actually needs at that point in gestation. That they had a lot of this inner wisdom without having all the sciencey stuff that we have now,
right,
just because of their experience and being able to kind of tune into what the body needed, that we kind of discount now because we get so stuck in the guidelines and the My Plate recommendations and USDA and FDA recommendations for everything. And we forget that there's more to it than just these recommendations.
I would love to take a look at those TCM recommendations. That'd be fascinating. I like to point out, for example, that we didn't have vitamin B12 supplements until like late in the 1900s. I believe it was somewhere between the 1950s and 1970s. I'd have to look up the exact dates, but it's very recent that it's even possible to grow a human being while completely excluding animal foods and not having severe consequences, right? Anemia. They used to not know what caused anemia, and there actually can be several nutritional causes, but before there were supplements available, they recommended liver. That was the treatment. And then lo and behold, when you analyze what's in liver, you have, well, there's a lot of things in liver, but you have high amounts of iron, zinc, vitamin B12, vitamin A, folate. We know that typical anemia, like iron deficiency anemia, is treated far better when you're also supplying vitamin B12 and vitamin A concurrently with iron. It just so happens that all was in liver, and that is also was a very effective treatment for anemia back in like the early 1900s, when we didn't have as large of an understanding, as large of a body of scientific evidence maybe as we do now. So a lot of times, when I'm looking at nutrition research, we're looking at like this tiny little piece of this massive puzzle. And we have to understand that A, we don't have all the answers. B, nature has this innate wisdom with food. A lot of nutrients work in tandem or in synergy with other nutrients, and we're just barely starting to pull apart or maybe put back together those pieces to unravel how it all works together. We just know it does work together. And we have more and more examples of how that actually comes into play in real life via some of these new studies, like choline and DHA. Those happen to work hand in hand. Choline helps sort of shuttle DHA across the placenta and incorporate it into the fetal brain better than DHA provided alone. Just so happens that you find choline and DHA packaged together in egg yolks and in fish and all sorts of seafood. It's like, oh. And then, of course, you take it another level. It just so happens that a lot of these cultures really encouraged the consumption of seafood and really high DHA seafood like fish roe, and high vitamin B12 seafood products like shellfish and mussels and clams and oysters. So a lot of this stuff is, I think it's important to sort of take a broad step back and look at some of the wisdom that was passed on. And then maybe we can start pulling some of the pieces together from modern science to understand why those recommendations came to be. It's sad that they haven't been incorporated into our guidelines when you think about it, because there is so much wisdom there that we've just sort of stomped our foot on because, science knows better.
Yeah, I think that is such a more well-rounded approach, is to look at what has worked and ask why, instead of stomp on it, like you said, and try to build it from scratch out of nothing. Like asking, why does it work? And trying to understand that. I mean, the packaging of food and how we've evolved to digest those foods, like liver is so much easier to digest than an iron supplement that most people have side effects from. And that's, a big part of why I don't take isolated supplements ever, and never have, because quite frankly, they scare me. I don't know what they're going to cause, what they're going to do, because they need to be packaged with all of the right activators and the right enzymes and everything to make them work in our body without those side effects. So to me, it makes more sense to do the liver and the egg yolk than to take the iron tablet.
Yeah, I do think it's important for people to approach supplementation from a standpoint of filling in the gaps or an insurance policy or correcting a deficiency, but looking at it as, exactly as the name implies, a supplement that's on top of an already nutrient dense diet, which a lot of people don't look at it that way. They look at supplements as the end all be all. Oh, I took my prenatal today, so, it's okay that I had XYZ really unhealthy food. And it's like, it's not going to kill you to do that every once in a while, but day in, day out for an entire pregnancy, relying on a prenatal vitamin as the sole source of micronutrients is really not a great idea. We should really be putting a lot more attention on food itself.
Yeah, and being very selective when we do choose the supplements that we're using to fill in the nutritional gaps. They definitely have a place, and we often have times where there's a need for them, but we need to be really careful about which ones we're choosing, how they're put together, what kind of thought went into creating that product. Chemical versus whole food approach. So do you want to spend some time musing on some other topics? to
Sure.
just chat about that don't necessarily have as much information steeped in research, but just to have a fun conversation.
I'm game.
Okay. So one of the things that I have noticed a correlation amongst different clients that I've worked with in varying capacities of prenatal health is nutritional status and improvement in outcomes of fetal positioning. So as far as trying to prevent breech babies from happening in the first place, and also spontaneous onset of labor, both on the side of not having premature babies, premature rupture of membranes, labor that's happening before 37 weeks, and going too far post-date, which, depending on your definition, can be anywhere from a little over 40 weeks to 42 weeks to 44 weeks. We don't have to get specific about the definition of that, but just kind of optimal timing for the individual woman and her baby. So I've definitely noticed that people that I've been able to work with throughout their pregnancy, sometimes before their pregnancy, their outcomes in those areas are far superior than people who come to me at the very end of their pregnancy and are either trying to correct a breach or trying to get labor going or trying to slow down something that seems like it's starting too early. So I'm curious, with the research that you've done and having worked with a broad range of populations, what your insight is on those kinds of correlations.
Well, I mean, first off, I think when we think about childbirth, like it's sort of like nutritional science. Modern times, we've really like thrown out all of the wisdom accumulated over centuries from midwives and tried to replace it with this obstetrics model, which is so counter everything that your intuition tells you to do in pregnancy. So I'm just going to throw that out there ahead of time.
Thank you.
But so I think your observations are valid. I will say that. We know there are always, lots of exceptions to the rule, and pregnancy brings with it, and birth, of course, some degree of this is not entirely within your control. So you kind of have to surrender to the process of what's going to happen, right? I will say that there is some research. I don't know about breech presentation and if that has anything to do nutrition wise, but in terms of preterm labor or premature rupture of membranes, there are actually a number of nutrients that seem to play a role in the likelihood of that. So for example, you can go to vitamin C. There's been some studies on vitamin C and like the strength of the amniotic sac, because when you think of that, it's a collagenous membrane. Vitamin C helps that collagen cross-link. I would argue that we should also be looking at consumption of collagen-rich foods and glycine, which we know we need in higher amounts in pregnancy for a lot of different reasons, for mom's tissues, but also for growing a brand new human being inside of you. I mean, this miraculous process, you need a lot of collagen to grow the bones, skin, nails, internal organs, vasculature, everything in that baby. So your body is naturally going to preferentially give as much of that to the actual baby itself. And it's possible that maybe the amniotic sac won't be as robust, I guess, might be a way to look at it. Certainly we have some of the data on vitamin C that points to that direction. So I theorize that there could be something with collagen with that part. We do know that vitamin D, for example, can play a very large role actually in the risk of preterm labor. So there's been a number of correlational studies that have made that determination, but there was also really interesting study. It was out of one of the Carolinas. I can't remember which one. And they gave across the board every client 5,000 IUs of vitamin D starting early in pregnancy. And they monitored their vitamin D levels, but they also looked at rates of certain pregnancy complications. So 5,000 IUs, by the way, is considered, at least conventionally, a really high amount because the RDA is 600 IUs. And most of the other studies that are like randomized controlled trials max out at about 4,000. But they gave 5,000 IUs per day, and they observed a 60% reduction in the rates of preterm delivery across all ethnicities, which is really interesting because we know that non-Caucasian pregnant women are at a higher risk of preterm labor. But this held true across all people, all skin colors. We know that when you have a darker skin color, it takes more time in the sun without sunscreen to make the same amount of vitamin D as somebody with pale skin. It's just in relation to the UVB rays and how they interact with your melanin and whether or not your skin makes vitamin D, right? So this was fascinating. And it was when vitamin D levels were at a threshold of 40 nanograms per mil or higher that they saw this substantial reduction in preterm birth. Vitamin D is like a topic I could talk about for hours. I actually have a whole continuing education webinar on vitamin D and pregnancy specifically, but that's a really interesting one to note because it's a factor that's within your control. I mean, you can get in the sun more, you can take vitamin D supplements, you can check your vitamin D levels to see if they line up with that recommendation or not. But I think that's a really interesting one to point out as well. There's a whole number of other nutrients that can play major and or minor roles in risks of preterm birth, even stress and like your cortisol levels, which can also have a nutritional relation as well, can play a role in risk of preterm birth. So I do think there's something there. I don't know if we ever have enough evidence to say for sure one way or another, but it does play a role. And I think it is a consideration because taking full responsibility for your health when you're pregnant, knowing that not everything is within your control, you may as well make note of the things that are within your control to at least try to, I always say, stack the deck in your favor for, a healthy, full-term, uncomplicated pregnancy and uncomplicated birth and easy postpartum recovery and on and on and on, right?
Yeah, I think it's pretty hard to go wrong if you are basing your diet on whole foods, real foods, and focusing on the right macro ratios as well. So what I have seen and spent some time studying through some of the Chinese medicine avenues is that it can go either way with nutrient deficiencies, that you can have preterm labor, which probably seems a little bit more intuitive to people how that could happen, like if the structure of the amniotic fluid is not strong enough. But I think also some of the stuff that we look at is it can go either way because you can be so deficient that the body just cannot sustain the ability to nourish the baby any longer. And so what's best for both beings at that point is for labor to start. And, maybe at some point mom just can't nourish that baby anymore inside. Right. And so the body just has to let go. At the other end of the spectrum, when it's kind of this low grade deficiency or maybe absorption just isn't working well, different aspects like that could be going on for a woman, that her body just doesn't quite build up the energy needed to get labor going in a way that like she can continue to sustain the baby. Her body has enough strength to continue to keep sustaining the baby, providing enough nutrients and blood supply for that, but not enough to actually get labor going because that's a huge expenditure of energy, right? Running a marathon. Yeah. So if they haven't built up enough strength for that, then they either have kind of a prodromal labor that doesn't quite get started, or they just don't go into labor at all and end up getting induced. So I have not seen that. I've
talked to a midwife friend of mine who actually teaches a course at Bastyr on prenatal nutrition, and they use Real Food for Pregnancy as the textbook now, which is pretty cool. But we had a conversation about how we wonder if the post-state pregnancies could have something to do with the body wanting to, like, maybe it's like, okay, we need more nutrition getting to this baby. Maybe brain development isn't quite where we want it to be before we let go, right? And we know there's like a huge transfer of DHA, for example, towards the end of pregnancy. We've also had that conversation as well. It's hard to know. I do think it can go both ways. And certainly I've talked to another different midwife friend about how she has observed that her vegetarian and vegan clients tend to go into labor on the earlier side rather than the later side. I don't know if that could have something to do with, the inadequate collagen intake from the diet, which could mean a less robust amniotic sac or what. But yeah, it's interesting. It would be really cool to have some, hardcore data on this, but I've heard similar musings on either side of the coin from different midwives I've talked to as well.
Yeah, I definitely don't have any specific research to base that up on. It's just 10 years of working with clients that I just started to notice that one of the things that I generally recommend is pretty high protein diet for most of my clients, which was also when your book came out, I was really happy to see that I was not the only one, but it was making a big difference in helping them, even sometimes for women who were coming in and were wanting to induce labor, somebody I'd never seen before. And they came in, coming to get acupuncture to have labor induced. And I would first assess their diet and see, why are you even stuck here? Why is labor not happening? Let's figure that out before we do the acupuncture, because acupuncture doesn't always work. And if there's other things going on, it's not going to work. And I need to figure that out for them first. So a lot of times I would have them go and have steak, have, whatever kind of protein that they wanted, but just up their protein, because, a lot of them are getting 50, 60 grams of protein a day, which is just not enough, especially third trimester. So, getting them to really start upping that, sometimes that would be the thing that seemed like a few days of getting a high amount of protein in would flip the switch. Maybe. I don't know. I don't know that was what did it. It just happened to so many people that you start to wonder, like, this probably really is actually a big deal.
It's like you need to build up your energy prior to labor. There's going to be it's a huge energetic expenditure, but also you lose blood. You naturally lose blood during labor, and you'll continue to lose blood. So is there something to, building up your iron and B12 stores prior to? I don't know. Is there something to building up, your vitamin A stores? We know colostrum, the first milk, is really high in vitamin A, and there's a huge transfer of vitamin A over the first 6 months of breastfeeding. It's like 60 times more vitamin A is transferred to baby during breastfeeding, for 6 months of breastfeeding, than the entirety of 9 months of pregnancy. So is there something to that? I don't know. That's really interesting though.
Yeah, I think there probably is the protein, but I think like that food packaging that we were talking about earlier, all those other components that are in animal products that probably contribute to the micronutrient status as well. That's, something in there may be what is needed in a significant enough quantity to help trigger the hormones of labor to activate. And if they're not there just may not be enough to rev that engine up and get it going.
Yeah, that's such an interesting idea.
Yeah. So I would also be curious on your take on intuitive eating in pregnancy, what you have seen from people that you've worked with in different nutritional statuses, if that affects their ability to know what to eat or not eat, or cravings, different things down that avenue.
Sure. So I'm personally a big proponent of intuitive eating or mindful eating. They're, in my opinion, they're one and the same, different terms for the same thing, wherein you are listening to your body's cues in terms of when, what, and how much to eat, and honoring that. It's as simple as that, and it's as hard as that. I think in pregnancy specifically, at least during my pregnancies, but also with, I'd say, the majority of my clients that I've worked with, they feel like their intuition is up a little more, right? Like there's a lot of signals your body sends you in pregnancy that you just can't ignore. So you see this, probably in the greatest amount, I would say, in like the first trimester, when a lot of people experience nausea and food aversions. I'd say many times there are aversions to meat and like strongly bitter vegetables early on. However, to go back to the question you had about working with people with different nutritional statuses, I have had situations where even in the first trimester where, you know, I would sort of expect everybody to have a meat aversion, for example. I've had some vegetarian and vegan clients who crave meat. Or I had one woman I was talking to where she was telling me that she was craving, she had been previously vegan and like raw vegan, like really hardcore vegan for a long time. And it was, you know, a thing that her and her partner had been doing for a long time. So it's, you know, a very important to their life and their choices. And she was craving liver, eggs, oysters, and bone broth. Like, you can't make this stuff up. She was craving, if I was to pick probably the top 4 foods that somebody who's vegetarian or vegan might want to consider consuming because they are so nutrient dense and will fill in virtually all of the micronutrient gaps that might be there in their diet, she named them all. And those are the ones that she was craving. And she was feeling really guilty for having started giving into some of those, because, you know, this was like a very important choice that her and her partner had made for their life, but it was like she couldn't stop herself. And so it was, you know, I approached it as, wow, that's so interesting. Did you know that this has XYZ nutrient that might be lacking? And this has XYZ nutrient that might be lacking. Like, wow, your body's so smart. And she felt so relieved and was happy to go forward eating those foods, knowing that it was actually going to provide her with better balanced nutrition, right? Whereas on the flip side, I've had clients who have been more on the paleo side, or even people who are like more like keto or carnivore leaning, where they're eating significantly more animal products than I'd say like the average like general public is eating. And those tend to be the people I notice who have the strongest meat aversions in the first trimester. Like, their body wants carbs. So I think, if anything, we have to just stay open to the signals that our body is sending us, because there's still so much mystery to pregnancy. You know, I love the factoids. I love the research. I love uncovering these little tidbits of information and sort of trying to like tie it all together and make sense of it. But we have to really humble ourselves to the fact that we don't know half, not even half of what's going on in pregnancy. We don't have a blueprint of, at this stage of pregnancy, you need XYZ amount of this, and then it changes the next week. And it'd be great if we had that information, but we don't. And so I'm a big fan of people following the lead of those cravings, with the caveat that if you're craving non-real food, like you're craving, you know, Cheetos or Cinnamon Toast Crunch cereal, your body isn't craving those foods because it's looking for a specific micronutrient that you might be missing, right? There are some foods that are industrially produced that are specifically engineered to be addictive and for you to crave them. And so it's probably more of an emotional craving, or just being on a blood sugar roller coaster where you're just sort of cyclically going for carbs, crashing your blood sugar, going for more processed carbs, and so on. But if the cravings are for actual unprocessed real food, I really think it's in our best interest to just go with it and be okay if there's periods of time, maybe in the first trimester, where your body wants more carbohydrates and doesn't want vegetables and doesn't want a whole bunch of meat, or only wants a small amount of meat or a certain type of meat, or only scrambled eggs, but not over easy, or over easy, but not scrambled, or whatever it is. Like, just roll with it for a little while. Almost everybody has a tough time in the first trimester, and know that your body is smart, just trust the process. I think that's really hard for people to trust the process and sort of let go of control. But that's like the ultimate teacher of pregnancy, to prepare you for birth and to prepare you for motherhood. And that involves surrendering a lot of expectations and a lot of control.
Yes, it sure does. So for your vegan client, a prime example of kids change everything, even if it's when they're only 8 weeks old, still on the inside.
Yep.
Yeah. And I think acknowledging that we really don't know what we don't know yet.
Yes.
There's just so much that we don't understand why this is a symptom of pregnancy, but it sure is. And most people are going to experience it, and it's not anything bad or good about it. It just is
right.
Something that comes with the territory for most people, not everybody, some lucky people. But I think with the intuitive eating, kind of differentiating between the cravings that are potentially an addiction
right.
to something in a processed food that may or may not have been put there intentionally, versus something that is a whole food craving, and it may not seem like a good food to you at the time, but is something in it your body needs and knows that it needs.
Yeah.
So my last question for you is if you could just share with us, so you now have 2 kids and 2 books, very busy woman, and you teach a lot as well. Why do you continue to do this work? What drives you to share this information?
So I would say just how behind our current guidelines are. I feel like we need, an even louder voice or movement to push for change, to undo nutritional misinformation. And I always feel like the work is done and then the work is not done. It feels like, okay, I came out with Real Food for Gestational Diabetes, and for, within months of coming out with the book, and I really didn't think many people would notice. I was just very tired of getting tagged in threads where people were being told they needed to eat ungodly quantities of carbohydrates and having terrible blood sugar, and thus having to go on insulin, when I was like, oh my gosh, this is all backwards. We need to change this. Within months of coming out with that book, people are like, so what do you recommend as a book for prenatal nutrition, right? And I was like, well, you don't need a separate book. You just do everything that's in Real Food for GD and just sort of, gloss over all the talk about blood sugar, which takes up the entire book. But just the same food stuff applies, right? Certainly Real Food for Pregnancy is a much different book than Real Food for Gestational Diabetes. It is written in different language. It goes into different details and whatnot. But the heart of it, the core of it, is the same message about incorporating these nutrient-dense foods that are needed for XYZ processes. And I've realized that, and I've started using the hashtag on social media every once in a while, real food is real food. I've realized that there are just so many facets of this conversation that apply to every life stage, that there can be many, many different topics to go into and tie it back to real food. The message ultimately is still going to be real food is real food. It's like, well, what do you feed your babies? What do you feed your toddler? What do you feed your husband? What do you eat to prepare for pregnancy? What do you eat for breastfeeding? What do you eat for hormone balance? And it's all the same thing. So even though I feel like the work is done because I've just shared the secret right there, the work is not done because people need to hear it expressed in many, many different ways and related to many, many different life stages and health conditions and topics in order for it to really sink in. So that's part of what keeps me going. What also keeps me going is just hearing from readers, hearing from women themselves who have had completely different pregnancy and postpartum experiences as a result of incorporating more real food into their diet, and also the clinicians that support them. I mean, I've had midwives reach out to me and be like, yeah, almost all the clients I have who follow your book, like, we have almost no perineal tears at labor now. Or if there is a tear, it's like completely healed within a week. We never see that. I had one lady who said she had a non-healing perineal tear. It was like 6 months of agony, which I can't even imagine. And her next pregnancy, she followed real food. Previously, she had been vegetarian. And A, there was no tear the second time, but B, she felt like her body and her pelvic floor, like, I hate the word bounced back, but those are the words that she used, very quickly. She healed very, very quickly. And so that for me is like what fuels continuing to talk about this stuff ad nauseum, is that for every person going through pregnancy for the first, or maybe the second, third, fourth time, when it's their first time incorporating real food, they need to hear this message, and they need to know how much it can transform their experience of pregnancy, of birth, of motherhood, of breastfeeding. I mean, it just goes on and on and on. And then as a gift that you can give your family as well. If you've, learned some new traditional cooking skills, then your family benefits from that for their whole life. And how does that impact your child when they're 14, 15, 16, 26, 36, starting their own family? It goes on and on.
Having worked in clinical practice and doing a lot of nutrition with those folks, mostly women, in the last 10 years, it definitely makes a difference. And having your book around makes my job a lot easier because now I can just hand them this book or have them go get the book and not have to write it all out for them.
Yes. Well, good.
But yeah, I think it doesn't matter what stage of life people are in. The information that's in your books is relevant. So even if you're not pregnant or not planning on having another baby, there's still information in that book that's going to help you feed your family.
Even if you don't want to have babies whatsoever.
Yep.
Information will help you have a well-regulated, healthy menstrual cycle that doesn't give you pain and agony every month, right? It's all related. And I think that's the thing that is so hard for us to understand, when really our whole life and oftentimes our education system makes us believe that everything is separate, right? Every system of your body is separate. The farmers are separate from the non-farmers, and it's all integrated. And I think that's probably like the biggest message of it all is like, it's all integrated. Real food is real food. It's good for you. It's good for your kids. It's good for your partner. It's good for your parents.
Yep.
Yeah.
Well, can you share with us where everybody can find you and get copies of your books or follow you to get more great information?
Sure. So you can find me on my website, which is lilynicholsrdn.com. And on that site, I have a free chapter of Real Food for Pregnancy that you can download, among many other freebies there as well. So definitely check that out. I am also on the usual social media channels. I can't say I'm particularly active at the moment on any of them, but generally I am most active on Instagram, and my handle is the same as my website. So Lily Nichols RDN. And I think people mostly like following me on social because I share what I'm eating. I also share fairly regularly some research updates from whatever I find that I think is interesting and worth sharing. I give you a little research brief on a specific study. As far as the books, you can learn more information about them on my website. They're available on Amazon for purchase, both of them in Kindle and paperback. And then I also have Real Food for Pregnancy as an audiobook for those of us moms who don't ever have time to sit down and actually read a book or just sit down, period. So check those out.
Well, thank you so much for coming and having this conversation with me today. I hope I didn't pull you out of your research seat too much.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Yes, it was really nice talking with you. Thank you so much for joining me today in this conversation with Lily Nichols. I hoped you learned as much as I did from her insights, her research, and her knowledge, and you're inspired to bring more real food into your everyday life. If you would like to follow Lily, you can find her at lilynicholsrdn.com. That's LILYNICHOLSRDN. You can also find her on Instagram at Lily Nichols RDN. If you have not read her books, no matter what stage of life you are in, I highly recommend them to anyone who wants to learn the how and why of eating real food. Again, her books are Real Food for Pregnancy and Real Food for Gestational Diabetes. You can find them on her website or anywhere that books are sold. As always, let me know how I can support your journey. If you have topics you want to hear about, guests you'd like to hear from, questions or comments to share, let me know. This podcast is always transforming, and you can help shape it into something that helps thousands of families have the best pregnancy, birth, and transition into parenthood possible by leaving a comment or a review or sharing this podcast with others in your life who will benefit from our discussions. Find me on the socials at Natural Birth Compass or email me at info@naturalbirthcompass.com. And don't forget to subscribe to this podcast so you don't miss out on our next episode. Wishing you a wonderful journey to birth. We have baby turkeys.
Oh.
Yeah.
I'm hearing the little
Yeah, they're hard to cover up. So they might be contributing their real food portion to the show.
That's okay. When I heard it, I thought it was like a cockatiel whistling in the background, but now I'm hearing the little peep, 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 peep of baby birds. Cute.
And now my neighbor's also out with a chainsaw, so hopefully that won't be on there.
Oh, I didn't hear that at all. So
yep.
I don't think it picked it up.
This is life.
Yeah. Well, good luck. I hope you do okay during this crazy thing.
Yeah, you too.
Take care.
Bye, Lily.
Bye.